The harbor at Coronado smelled of salt, diesel, and ceremony. It was a Thursday in November, the kind of California November that never fully commits to cold, the air dry and bright, the bay flat and metallic under a sky that had not decided between gray and blue. The USS Constellation sat moored at Pier 4, dressed in full regalia for the occasion. Signal flags running stem to stern, the crew in whites arranged in two parallel lines along the flight deck, every crease pressed to geometric precision. From the dock below, looking up at the steel wall of the carrier's hull, you understood something without being told it. Some things are designed specifically to make human beings feel small. Warships do this deliberately. The ceremony was a commissioning event of secondary importance. A formal reception recognizing a cooperation program between the United States Navy and a visiting martial arts delegation from Hong Kong. There would be speeches, there would be photographs, there would be a demonstration of training techniques for the benefit of senior, enlisted and officer class personnel who had some institutional interest in what Asian combatives had to offer the modern fighting man. 300 people were present on the dock and the elevated observation platform above it. Navy personnel in varying degrees of formality occupied the folding chairs arranged in 12 rows before a temporary hardwood platform. Officers stood along the rail of the observation platform, 7 stories up, with a clear vertical sight line to the demonstration floor. The harbor wind moved through at intervals, stirring the dress uniforms and the signal flag simultaneously, and the sound of it was the sound of a room turning a page. The 5 men from the visiting delegation occupied a space at the rear of the platform, beside the equipment cases they had transported from the hotel. They were not in uniform. They wore matching dark training clothes, simple, without adornment, and they had arranged themselves in the loose, practiced formation of men who train together and who are therefore never entirely off duty in one another's presence. They were watching the crowd with the patient attention of professionals who have learned to read rooms. They were large men, not uniformly. One was built for speed, lean and long, and one was built for groundwork, low-centered and barrel-chested, but the average among them was substantial, and they carried their size with the ease of men who have lived inside it so long it has become invisible to them. The tallest was 6 feet 2. The heaviest was somewhere above 230 pounds, with the particular density of a man who has compressed himself through years of impact training rather than weight rooms. Together, they occupied the rear of the platform the way a piece of furniture occupies a room, solidly, without apology, with a kind of geometric finality. The officers on the observation platform above had already begun noting them. Conversations were happening in the lateral language of military men, slight head movements, quiet mouth, eyes that appear to be looking at something other than what they are looking at. The men in the chairs below were less restrained. A cluster of petty officers in the 4th row were openly gesturing between themselves and the 5 men on the platform, constructing the arithmetic of size and weight that enlisted men have constructed beside every demonstration since the form was invented. Then the delegation's full complement arrived. He came up the gangway from the dock level, alone, through the gap in the crowd that opened for him in the way crowds open for men who have been introduced. He had been introduced, briefly, to the ranking officer at the foot of the pier, and the officer had nodded in the formal way of men who have been told a name means something and are reserving judgment on the claim. He wore dark trousers, a white dress shirt with the top button open, and a plain dark jacket that sat on his frame with no particular tailoring. He was 5 feet 7. He was lean with the particular leanness of a man operating at his body's intended specification, nothing withheld and nothing surplus. He crossed the platform in 11 steps and took his position beside the equipment cases without looking at the 5 men beside him. 2 of the petty officers in the 4th row exchanged a look. On the observation platform above, a lieutenant commander said something to the man beside him quietly. The man beside him looked down at the platform and then looked back and said something that caused the lieutenant commander to produce a small lateral smile. Bruce Lee stood by the equipment cases and looked at the harbor. He appeared to be in no particular state. No visible preparation, no visible tension, no outward marking of a man aware of the scrutiny being applied to him from multiple vertical levels above and across. He was simply standing, waiting, present without performance, in the manner of a man who does not require the room to understand what it is looking at before he is ready to proceed. Something was being arranged. Everyone on the platform, and many in the chairs, and at least 4 of the officers on the rail above, understood this. What it was, who had arranged it, what form it would take, what the 5 men at the rear of the platform were intending, was not yet visible. But it was coming. The program began with the delegation's senior representative, a compact man in his 50s named Master Chun, who addressed the assembled personnel through an interpreter for 9 minutes. He spoke about the origin and philosophy of the training system the delegation represented, and the interpreter rendered his words in careful English that preserved their architecture. The crowd listened with variable attention, some deeply, most politely, some with the calibrated disengagement of people who have learned to appear present during institutional speech without incurring its full cost. Then the format shifted. Master Chin spoke 1 additional sentence. The interpreter said, "What you are about to observe is not a performance. It is a practical examination." This landed differently than the previous 9 minutes. Several men in the chairs rearranged themselves. The officers on the rail above went still. The 5 men in dark training clothes moved forward from the rear of the platform. They spread across the hardwood with the quiet efficiency of people who have practiced the movement, not choreographed, but familiar, the way a squad moves through a position it has occupied before. They did not look at the crowd. They looked at the center of the platform, where Bruce Lee was standing. He had not moved. He was still in the same position he had taken when he crossed the platform, slightly left of center, weight distributed neutrally between both feet, hands at his sides. The jacket was still on. He was looking at the 5 men the way a navigator looks at a chart, not with alarm, with information gathering. The tallest of the 5, the man who stood 6'2", stepped forward from the line. He had a face built for authority, broad jaw, deep-set eyes, a natural severity that required no cultivation. He had been training since he was 11 years old. He had broken 3 opponents' ribs in sanctioned competition in the preceding 18 months, and this number was known to approximately half the people on the platform because the delegation's cultural liaison had mentioned it during the morning briefing, either carelessly or deliberately. He looked at Bruce Lee for a moment with an expression that was not hostile and was therefore more unsettling than hostility would have been. It was the expression of a man who is good enough at what he does that he has learned to reserve aggression for situations that actually require it. 5 against 1, he said, and his English was deliberate. Each word placed carefully is not an insult. It is a question. We want to know what the answer is. A murmur moved through the rows of chairs. Not laughter, something closer to the sound a crowd makes when a bet is placed in front of them that they had not expected to be offered. From the observation platform above, someone leaned forward on the rail. Bruce Lee's expression did not change. He looked at the tall man with the same calm inventory he had been applying to the harbor, to the crowd, to the platform surface itself. He appeared to be genuinely considering the statement on its merits rather than reacting to its framing. "What's the question?" he said. The tall man gestured once, briefly, at his 4 colleagues. Whether one man can hold 5 directions at once. There was no mockery in his voice, no theater. The statement was delivered as a technical proposition and was received that way, except that a technical proposition does not usually make 300 people stop breathing simultaneously. The barrel-chested man to the left, the heaviest of the 5, said something in Cantonese to the man beside him. The man beside him responded quietly, and both of them shifted their weight in a way that was subtle and precise and functionally indistinguishable from the beginning of something. One of the petty officers in the 4th row said, quietly enough that only the men on either side of him heard. "This is going to be very short." The interpreter looked at Master Chun. Master Chin's face was unreadable, but his hands, which had been folded, had now moved to his lap and rested there open, a small gesture that suggested a transition from patience to attention. Bruce Lee looked at the 5 men arrayed before him. He looked at the tall one, then the barrel-chested one, then the lean one on the right flank, then the 2 he had not yet catalogued. One of average build with the hands of someone who has spent years in striking work, and one who had said nothing and moved the least, and was therefore the one Bruce Lee had spent the most time considering. "Yes," he said. One word. Then he reached up to the lapel of his jacket. The crowd understood, collectively, that the answer to the question was not going to be no. The crowd also believed, with the weight of 300 observations added together, that the answer to the question was nevertheless going to be no. The 5 men spread wider, taking their angles. Bruce Lee removed his jacket. He removed it the same way he had folded it every time before. Right arm first, then left one fold along the center crease, and he placed it on the corner of the equipment case to his right with the unhurried precision of a man who fully intends to retrieve it later. He straightened. He looked at his sleeves and rolled each one once. Left then right, 2 clean turns of fabric that brought the cotton above his forearms and kept it there. The forearms, uncovered, were immediately relevant, not in a manner requiring annotation. The body made its own argument, the geometry of compressed function, the kind of physical development that does not come from any single discipline, but from years of cross-examination in which the body is asked the same question in progressively harder forms until it knows the answer from the inside out. The platform had gone quiet. The sound of the harbor filled in, water against hull, the distant engine noise of a tender, the halyard of the signal flags snapping once against its line in a gust that passed through and was gone. Then quiet again. The 5 men were in position. They had not rushed to their positions. They had arrived in them through a process of gradual redistribution, the kind of spatial arrangement that requires experience to recognize for what it is. They had taken 3 quadrants and 2 flanking points, which is the standard geometry for 5-against-1 scenarios practiced by any serious combatives tradition. No single angle of escape was unobserved. No single direction of movement would allow a clean exit. The tall man was at 12 o'clock, facing directly. The barrel-chested man had taken 9 o'clock. The lean man was at 3. The striker, the one with the worked hands, was at 7. The quiet one, the one who had moved least, had taken 5 o'clock, slightly behind the right rear. The most dangerous position. The position that cannot be watched without turning away from at least 2 others. Bruce Lee stood in the center of this geometry and appeared to be doing nothing. His feet were at shoulder width. His hands were at waist height, not raised, not fisted, the fingers slightly curved, the wrists relaxed but not slack. He was looking at a point in the middle distance that corresponded to no particular man, which meant that all 5 of them fell within his peripheral resolution simultaneously. His breathing was not visible. This was the detail that the man seated in the first row, a Navy corpsman with training in trauma response, would remember most clearly afterward. 300 people watching a man about to face 5 opponents, and his breathing was not visible. The tall man's jaw shifted once. Not nervousness, recalibration. He had been in situations of physical confrontation many times, and his jaw made this movement when he was moving from the assessment phase to the commitment phase. The men who knew him recognized it. In the chairs, no one spoke. The petty officer who had predicted shortness was perfectly still. On the observation platform above, the lieutenant commander had both hands on the rail. Somewhere in the equipment cases, a digital clock was ticking, though no one could hear it. Bruce Lee exhaled, once barely perceptible, the kind of exhale that empties rather than releases, a deliberate clearing of the system. His shoulders dropped half a centimeter, not from tension leaving, from a final decision being made. The tall man moved. His right foot advanced 6 inches. Not a step, a declaration. The formal signal that the interval was ending. Bruce Lee's eyes moved for the first time since he had taken his position. They moved to the quiet man at 5 o'clock and stayed there for 4 seconds. The quiet man, who had not moved since taking his position, who had been the most controlled presence in the arrangement, shifted his weight almost imperceptibly to his front foot. Then all 5 of them moved. The tall man came first. Direct line. The center line assault, designed to force a response, designed to commit Bruce Lee's attention forward. Bruce Lee wasn't there. Left. Fast. Not a step. A displacement. The whole body translated sideways in a single committed motion, weight arriving on the outside foot fully loaded before the eye could segment the movement into its components. The tall man's lead leg planted where Bruce Lee had been standing. Empty floor. The lean man at 3 o'clock pivoted and lunged, catching the lateral movement, angling to cut off the new position. Fast. Trained. He had done this before. Crack. The heel of Bruce Lee's palm, already moving before the lunge completed, loaded from the lateral translation that had just finished, connected with the lean man's lead shoulder at full extension. Not the face, not the chest. The shoulder. The precise geometry of the acromioclavicular joint, where the force would radiate laterally and down simultaneously, disrupting the shoulder's participation in the lunge mid-execution. The lean man's right side folded a degree, and he staggered past. Momentum redirected rather than stopped. A rock deflected from a wall, sent at a new angle. No pause. Bruce Lee was already turning. The barrel-chested man at 9 had covered ground fast, faster than his mass suggested was available to him. He was low. His center was dropped. A grappler's approach. Not a strike, but an entry. Aiming for the torso, aiming for the leverage that weight advantage makes possible. Bruce Lee met the entry angle sideways. Not retreating, perpendicular. He stepped across the barrel-chested man's line of approach rather than away from it, and his right hand found the back of the man's right arm of the tricep, and he added to the momentum rather than resisting it, contributing directional force that turned the grappler's own mass against his intended vector. 230 pounds of forward pressure was redirected at 20 degrees, not stopped, aimed, and the barrel-chested man arrived at the platform floor on his hands and knees with his own velocity intact and nowhere to go. Thud. Hard. The crowd sound, not a gasp. Something lower. An exhalation that had been compressed into something smaller than a gasp. The sound a room makes when it has been surprised below the level of language. The striker at 7 was in motion. He had read the room better than the others. He had not committed during the first 2 seconds, had waited, had let the first exchanges establish Bruce Lee's movement pattern. He came with a combination. Jab to create response, cross to capitalize on it. Classical. Sound. Practiced. The jab. Bruce Lee parried with his left forearm, a rotational contact, not a block, using the incoming energy's own arc to redirect it upward and across. The cross. His weight was already leaving the position the cross was aimed at, the body rotating clockwise as the jab parried, and the cross passed through a space his torso had vacated by 40 degrees. Inside now. From inside, a single ridge hand strike to the striker's floating rib. The knuckle edge of the left hand, the fingers pressed flat, the wrist locked, the force driven not from the arm but from the hip rotation that had been loading since the parry began. The arm was a transfer mechanism. The engine was the floor, the leg, the hip, arriving at the contact point as a single coherent event. Snap. The striker bent at the waist. Not falling. The human body's immediate response to that particular impact is a protective fold, the torso bringing the rib cage down to shield the sight. He stepped back once, then twice. For seconds elapsed. 3 men displaced, 1 down, 1 compromised. Then the doubt arrived. The tall man had reset. He was good. He had absorbed the failure of the initial approach without losing his structure, and he had read the pattern. The lateral preference, the inside entry, the hip-driven strikes, and he came back differently. He came wide, arms out. He was using his wingspan, forcing Bruce Lee to either engage with the arms before the body or create distance, and either option surrendered the initiative briefly. And the quiet man at 5 o'clock had not yet engaged. The quiet man moved now. He moved low and fast from the rear quadrant, the angle that required looking away from the tall man to address, the angle designed specifically to create an irresolvable geometric conflict. The crowd gasped. The lieutenant commander on the rail above said nothing, but his hands tightened on the steel. Bruce Lee did not choose between them. He chose the floor. He dropped, complete, committed, both knees to the hardwood in a single motion, ducking below the tall man's extended arms while the momentum of his drop loaded his legs. The quiet man's forward entry passed over him, the angle designed for a standing opponent finding only air. From the floor, both legs drove simultaneously. He came up with the momentum of the drop stored in his thighs and released, his right elbow leading at chest height as he rose, the point of the elbow connecting with the tall man's solar plexus at the intersection of the tall man's own forward step. The tall man's breath, gone. The quiet man, having passed over the drop, was rotating to re-engage, and Bruce Lee was already behind him. One hand to the back of the shoulder blade, one to the elbow, a pressure application that had no name in any Western system, but that expressed in 3 seconds everything about the relationship between leverage and mass. That mass is only an advantage when the leverage point is not controlled. And when it is, mass is simply more energy available to be redirected at the person who brought it. The quiet man went to the floor in a controlled way. Not slammed, placed. The tall man had not fallen. He was bent forward, hands on knees, breathing toward recovery. He was looking at Bruce Lee from below. Slow. The world slows here. Bruce Lee standing at the center of the platform, 5 opponents in various stages of displacement around him. The platform floor marked with the impact records of what had transpired. Not a scratch on him, not a disrupted sleeve. The tall man looked up. Bruce Lee looked back at him, waiting, patient. The tall man straightened slowly. He breathed. He made a small gesture with his right hand, open palm, a formal signal. Enough. And silence spread from the center of that platform outward, through the rows of chairs, up the 7 stories to the observation rail, and over the side of the carrier and into the harbor itself, until the entire visible world was quiet. 300 people did not know what to do with what they had just seen. The 5 men on the platform processed their situations with varying degrees of physical urgency. The barrel-chested man was back on his feet, rotating his shoulder. The striker was standing upright with one hand pressed his ribs, not rubbing, just monitoring. The lean man was already composed, the professional recovery of a man trained to absorb outcomes without dwelling in them. The quiet man had risen from the floor without assistance and was standing at ease, which was the most dignified thing happening on the platform. The tall man remained near the center, facing Bruce Lee from 8 feet. His face had reorganized itself. The authority that had lived there before the encounter had not left. It had deepened, which is the particular evolution that a man of genuine competence undergoes when he encounters something that exceeds him. He was not diminished. He was recalibrated, which is different and rarer. No one in the chairs spoke. From the observation platform above, the lieutenant commander was looking at his hands on the rail. He had not moved them. He appeared to be considering the experience of having had them there for the duration. In the second row, a chief petty officer with 22 years of service leaned slightly toward the man beside him and said, barely audible, "How many times did he get hit?" The man beside him said nothing, because the answer was 0, and the number was too strange to say aloud without testing the credibility of everyone present. Bruce Lee was adjusting his sleeve. He had rolled it back down, left first, then right, each cuff button with the same economy of motion he had applied to every other physical event in the preceding minutes. He moved to the equipment case and retrieved his jacket, shook it once, put it on. The jacket sat on his frame as it had before. Nothing had changed. He looked at the 5 men. A brief look containing no apology and no satisfaction. The look of a man acknowledging a transaction that is now complete. The tall man held the look. He nodded once. A slow nod, the deep nod of a man giving something substantial. Bruce Lee turned toward the edge of the platform. He walked across the hardwood toward the gangway that led back down to the dock. He passed the rows of chairs, and no one moved or spoke as he passed, and the silence had the quality of something being honored rather than something being withheld. He reached the gangway. He stopped at the top of it, one hand on the cable handrail, and for a moment he looked out at the harbor, the flat water, the moored carrier, the signal flags moving in the wind, the specific, ordinary beauty of a November afternoon on the California coast. He did not look back at the platform when he spoke. His voice was even and quiet, and carried in the particular way that quiet voices carry in outdoor spaces when everything else has gone still. 5 directions, he said. There is only one answer to 5 directions. Be nowhere, then be everywhere. He descended the gangway. The sound of his footsteps on the metal grating receded, and then stopped, and then was replaced by the sound of the harbor, which had been waiting patiently to return. On the observation platform above, a commander who had been silent the entire time turned to the lieutenant commander beside him and said something that the lieutenant commander would not repeat for 6 years. And when he finally did repeat it, he would say only that it was the most accurate thing he had heard said about a human being in his career. In the second row of chairs, the chief petty officer with 22 years pressed his hands flat on his thighs and stared at the empty platform for a long time without saying anything at all. The naval ceremony at Coronado did not appear in any official record as anything other than what its program described: a cooperative demonstration between a visiting martial arts delegation and United States Navy personnel. The attendance was noted. The visiting delegates were noted. No incident was recorded because what happened on that platform was not an incident. It was a demonstration of something that 300 people spent the rest of their lives trying to accurately describe. The story spread the way harbor water spreads when a stone enters it, in every direction from the point of contact, at varying speeds, thinning as it expanded, but never entirely disappearing. Sailors retold it to other sailors at other installations in other ports in other hemispheres. The numbers shifted. Sometimes the 5 became 7. Sometimes the ceremony became a confrontation. Sometimes the location moved. What did not shift was the center of the story, because the center was not a number and not a location. The center was the quality of the silence after. The 5 men from a delegation were professional enough to retell the account without inflation, which made their version the most unsettling one to hear, because the absence of inflation left no room for skepticism. The tall man, who returned to Hong Kong and trained fighters for the next 30 years, was asked about it twice in formal interviews. Both times he gave the same answer, which was that what he remembered most was not the physical events of the encounter, but the experience during it of understanding that his internal timeline was running behind the external events. He knew what was happening approximately half a second after it had already happened and been survived. It was not speed, he said. I know speed. It was something that speed is made from. Something before speed. The officers on the observation platform above were not, as a professional class, given to mysticism. They were trained in the evaluation of performance under observable conditions, and they applied those standards to what they had watched from 7 stories up. Several of them, in private conversation over the following years, arrived at the same operational conclusion, that what they had observed represented a level of spatial intelligence and physical integration that exceeded the current categories their training provided for evaluation. They did not know what category to assign it to. They assigned it to the category of things they had seen with their own eyes and could not therefore dismiss, which for a military officer is about as close to awe as the professional vocabulary allows. The corpsman from the first row, the man who had noticed the breathing, spent the following 3 years investigating what he had seen through the available literature on neuromuscular training, reaction time physiology, and the biomechanics of force transfer. He arrived at partial explanations for everything except the breathing. And the breathing was the thing he kept returning to, because the breathing was the first evidence he had encountered of a human being operating in a genuine state of readiness that carried none of the physiological signatures of stress, which meant it was not preparation. It was a state of being, something cultivated so thoroughly that the extraordinary had been made ordinary, and the ordinary had been made invisible. He wrote about it once, in a personal document that he did not share, and the document contained one line that he eventually crossed out because it seemed too large a conclusion for the evidence available. The line was, he had already finished before he began. But he did not destroy the document. He kept it. The harbor at Coronado continued to receive ships and release them. The ceremony was repeated the following year with a different delegation and a different format, and was not remembered by anyone. The pier where the gangway had stood was resurfaced in the spring, and the hardwood platform was dismantled, and the signal flags were replaced. None of this affected anything. The story had already left the physical location. It was traveling at the speed of human testimony, which is slower than light and faster than forgetting, and it was landing in the minds of men and women who had never been to Coronado and would never go. And in those minds, it was doing the same work it had done in the minds of the 300 who were present. It was asking a question, not the question the tall man had asked, not whether one man can hold 5 directions. A quieter question, a question about the nature of preparation, about whether mastery is a thing you acquire or a thing you become, about the difference between a man who is ready and a man who has made readiness so permanent that the word no longer separates him from a state it describes. Bruce Lee never knew how many rooms the story entered. He would not have counted. A man who does not require his opponents to already understand him does not require posterity to understand him either. He simply walked down the gangway and onto the dock and into the November afternoon, and the harbor light caught him once as he turned toward the street. And then it was just an afternoon. But the afternoon never entirely ended for the 300 who watched from the chairs and the rail and the rows. Some things do not close when the door does. They only wait for the next room to open.